Harold Pemberton woke up every morning at exactly 5:30, just like he had for the past 45 years. But now, instead of hearing his wife's gentle breathing beside him, he heard only the ticking of the old clock on the knitstand. The silence felt heavier than a winter blanket, pressing down on his chest until he had to sit up just to breathe properly. He would shuffle to the kitchen in his worn slippers, the floorboards creaking under his feet like old bones. The coffee maker still had 2 cups sitting beside it, even though he'd been alone for 3 years now. His wife used to joke that he made coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Now he wondered if that was really possible, because Lord knows he'd tried. Harold's farm wasn't much to look at anymore. 20 acres of struggling crops and a handful of chickens that seemed to lay fewer eggs each month. The red barn needed painting, and the fence posts were leaning like tired old men, but it was all he had left of the life he'd built with his wife. She used to tend a vegetable garden right behind the house, humming old songs while she pulled weeds. Now that patch of earth was just brown dirt and memories. The worst part wasn't the empty house or the quiet mornings, it was the evenings. When the sun started setting and the shadows grew long, Harold felt like he might disappear right along with the daylight. He'd sit in his recliner, the same one where his wife used to curl up with her knitting, and talk to her photograph on the side table. He told her about his day, about how the tomatoes weren't growing right, about how their youngest grandson had called from college. Sometimes he'd catch himself waiting for her to answer back, and the silence that followed felt like a punch to the gut. His children meant well, but they had their own lives in distant cities. They called on Sundays and visited twice a year, bringing sympathy casseroles and worried looks. The people in town treated Harold like he was made of glass, speaking in hushed voices and patting his shoulder with careful hands. Mrs. Peterson from the grocery store would ask how he was holding up, and he'd nod and say fine, even though fine felt like a foreign word in his mouth. The truth was, Harold felt like he was slowly fading away, becoming as gray and forgotten as last year's newspapers. His daily routine had become a series of small battles against the emptiness. He'd force himself to shower and shave even when he didn't plan on leaving the house. He'd cook simple meals for one, though food had lost most of its taste. Everything reminded him of her, the way she'd hum while making breakfast, how she'd steal bites of his dessert with a mischievous grin, the way she'd scold him for leaving his boots by the door. Harold started talking to the chickens just to hear a voice, even if it was his own. He'd tell them about the weather, about the crops, about anything that came to mind. The chickens didn't judge him for the way his voice cracked sometimes, or how he'd stop mid-sentence when the loneliness hit him like a wave. Neighbors would see him working in his fields, moving slower than he used to, taking breaks to lean against his tractor and stare off into the distance. Some folks whispered that old Harold was losing his mind, talking to himself and letting his farm go to pieces. But Harold wasn't crazy. He was drowning in silence, gasping for the sound of another human voice that actually cared about his answer. When they asked how he was doing, the Morrison brothers lived on the neighboring property, and they were the kind of men who found entertainment in other people's pain. They'd known Harold for 20 years, had even attended his wife's funeral with appropriately serious faces. But behind his back, they made jokes about the sad old widower who couldn't get over his dead wife. They'd sit on their porch drinking beer, watching Harold work his fields alone, and place bets on how long it would take him to completely fall apart. These weren't good men. They were the type who'd grown up pulling wings off flies and had never really grown out of it. They ran a small auto repair shop in town, the kind of place where the coffee was always burnt and the jokes were always cruel. Customers tolerated them because they were cheap and did decent work, but nobody really liked them. One evening in late September, Harold found himself at Murphy's Diner, sitting alone at a corner booth with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The Morrison brothers were at the counter, their loud voices carrying across the small restaurant. Harold wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but their conversation was impossible to ignore. They were talking about some woman from the next county over, making crude jokes about her 4 dead husbands. Harold felt his face flush with anger. He'd been married to the same woman for 42 years, and the idea of joking about someone's grief made his stomach turn. but he was too tired to confront them, too worn down by his own sorrow to fight anyone else's battles. The diner's owner, an elderly man named Pete, came over to refill Harold's cup. Pete had known Harold since they were boys, had been at his wedding, had helped carry his wife's casket. He sat down across from Harold without being invited, the way old friends do. Harold found himself talking, really talking, for the first time in months. He told Pete about the crushing weight of silence, about how he'd started leaving the television on all night just to hear human voices. He admitted that he'd been thinking about dating again, not because he wanted to replace his wife, but because he wasn't sure he could survive much more loneliness. Pete listened without judgment, nodding in the right places, understanding the kind of pain that comes with losing your life partner. But the Morrison brothers heard every word. They exchanged glances and grins, the kind of looks that promised trouble for someone unfortunate enough to cross their path. Harold finished his coffee and drove home to his empty house, unaware that he'd just given two cruel men exactly what they needed to plan their twisted idea of entertainment. He went to bed that night talking to his wife's photograph, telling her about his conversation with Pete, asking her what she thought he should do about the loneliness that was eating him alive from the inside out. He fell asleep holding her pillow, breathing in the last fading traces of her perfume, while across town, the Morrison brothers were already plotting their cruel joke. The Morrison brothers couldn't stop grinning as they walked out of Murphy's diner that night. They'd struck gold, and they knew it. Harold's confession about wanting to date again was like Christmas morning for two men who thrived on making others miserable. They drove home in their beat-up pickup truck, already cooking up ideas that would have made decent people sick to their stomachs. Tommy Morrison was the older brother by 2 years, with graying hair and hands permanently stained with motor oil. He'd never been married himself, claimed women were too much trouble and too expensive. His younger brother Billy was cut from the same cloth, bitter about life and always looking for someone else to blame for his problems. Together they'd spent 30 years finding creative ways to make their neighbors uncomfortable. They'd done things before, small, mean things that never quite crossed the line into illegal territory. They'd spread rumors about the bank manager's drinking problem, told lies about the schoolteacher's husband having an affair, even convinced old Mrs. Fletcher that her own grandson was stealing from her purse. But this was their masterpiece. Billy cracked open a beer and leaned back in his kitchen chair. The brothers lived together in a house that hadn't seen a woman's touch in decades. Empty bottles lined the windowsills, and the smell of stale cigarettes clung to everything like a second coat of paint. This was where they did their best thinking, if you could call it that. Tommy pulled out a notebook and started scribbling down ideas. They knew they needed a woman, someone desperate enough to go along with their plan without asking too many questions, someone who wouldn't figure out their game until it was too late. That's when Billy remembered Eleanor Whitfield. From the next county over, Eleanor lived alone in a small house about 30 miles away, in a town even smaller than theirs. She'd buried 4 husbands over the years, each one dying from natural causes, heart attacks, cancer, old age. Some people whispered that Eleanor was cursed, that she was bad luck for any man who married her. But the Morrison brothers saw something else in her story. They saw opportunity. Eleanor wasn't a wealthy woman, but she wasn't poor either. Each husband had left her a little something, a small insurance policy, a modest savings account, a paid-off house. Nothing spectacular, but enough to keep her comfortable. More importantly, she was getting older and probably getting scared about spending her final years alone. The brothers had met Eleanor once at a church social in the county seat. She was a well-dressed woman with intelligent eyes and a sharp tongue. She didn't suffer fools gladly, and she had a way of making people uncomfortable with her direct questions and honest observations. But she was also clearly lonely, sitting by herself at most events, watching other couples with a look that spoke of deep sadness. Tommy started making phone calls the next morning. He tracked down Eleanor's number and spent a week figuring out how to approach her. The brothers knew they'd have to be clever about this. Eleanor wasn't stupid, and she'd been around long enough to spot a con man from a mile away. They needed to make their lies believable, wrapped in just enough truth to fool someone who wanted desperately to believe. When Tommy finally called Eleanor, he introduced himself as a friend of Harold's family. He spun a story about Harold being a successful farmer who owned hundreds of acres of prime land. He talked about Harold's loneliness since his wife died, painting him as a gentleman who was ready to share his comfortable life with the right woman. Tommy mentioned that Harold was particularly interested in finding an educated, refined lady who could appreciate the finer things in life. Eleanor listened carefully to every word. She'd been fooled before by men who promised more than they could deliver, and she wasn't about to make that mistake again. But something in Tommy's voice sounded sincere, and the details he provided seemed too specific to be completely made up. Harold sounded like the kind of man she'd been hoping to find, stable, established, and ready for a real partnership. Tommy sweetened the deal by mentioning that Harold was willing to move quickly. He was tired of being alone, Tommy explained, and if he found the right woman, he'd want to marry her as soon as possible. This appealed to Eleanor's practical nature. At 71, she didn't have time to waste on long courtships and empty promises. The brothers spent hours crafting their story, making sure every detail matched up. They described Harold's house as bigger than it really was, his land as more valuable than it actually was, and his savings account as fuller than it had ever been. They painted a picture of a man who could provide security and companionship for Eleanor's golden years, but they weren't done with their deception. They also had to sell Eleanor to Harold, and that required a completely different set of lies. Billy took charge of this part of the operation. He approached Harold at the hardware store a few days later, pretending to bump into him by accident. Billy mentioned that he'd heard Harold was interested in finding companionship. He claimed to know a wonderful woman from a good family, someone who'd been widowed and was looking for a kind, honest man to share her life with. He described Eleanor as refined and educated, someone who'd traveled and read books and could bring culture and conversation to Harold's quiet life. The lies rolled off Billy's tongue like honey. He told Harold that Eleanor came from money, that she had savings and investments that would make any man's retirement more comfortable. He painted her as younger than she really was, more attractive than she actually was, and more desperate for Harold's attention than she truly felt. Harold listened with growing interest. The woman Billy described sounded perfect, someone who could fill the terrible silence in his house, someone who shared his values and understood the importance of commitment. Billy casually mentioned that Eleanor was eager to meet the right man and wouldn't waste time with games or long engagements. The brothers had found their perfect victims. Two lonely people, both hungry for companionship, both willing to believe in second chances. Harold and Eleanor were decent folks who'd been knocked down by life and were trying to find reasons to hope again. The Morrison brothers saw that hope as weakness, something to be exploited for their own twisted entertainment. Over the next week, Tommy and Billy refined their plan. They arranged for Harold and Eleanor to meet at a small cafe halfway between their towns. They told each of their victims that the other was eager for the meeting, that this could be the beginning of something wonderful. They even offered to help with transportation and suggested that if things went well, the couple might want to get married that very same day. The brothers congratulated themselves on their cleverness. They were setting up two desperate old people for the biggest disappointment of their lives. They imagined Harold's face when he saw Eleanor's age, Eleanor's reaction when she realized Harold's modest circumstances. They pictured the awkward conversation, the hurt feelings, the long drive home in separate cars. What they didn't anticipate was that sometimes, when two honest people meet each other, something real can happen. Something that can't be predicted or controlled by men who've never understood the difference between loneliness and love, between desperation and hope, between cruelty and kindness. Harold woke up that Tuesday morning feeling something he hadn't experienced in 3 years, nervous excitement. His hands shook slightly as he shaved, and he cut himself twice with the old razor. He'd laid out his best clothes the night before. A navy blue suit that still smelled faintly of mothballs, a white shirt he'd ironed 3 times, and a tie his late wife had bought him for their 40th anniversary. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror, trying to see himself through a stranger's eyes. The man looking back had gray hair that refused to stay in place, deep lines around tired eyes, and hands that showed every year of farm work. He wondered what this Eleanor woman would think of him. Would she see the loneliness written across his face like words on a page? Meanwhile, 30 miles away, Eleanor was having her own morning crisis. She'd changed outfits 4 times, settling on a simple blue dress with a pearl necklace that had belonged to her mother. At 71, she'd learned not to expect miracles, but she couldn't help hoping that today might be different. She'd been disappointed by men before, but something about this Harold fellow sounded genuine. Eleanor had spent the previous evening doing something she hadn't done in years. She'd gotten excited about the future. She'd even called her sister in Florida to tell her about the meeting. Her sister had been cautiously supportive, reminding Eleanor to be careful but not to let fear keep her from taking chances. The drive to the meeting place took Harold through countryside he'd known his whole life. Rolling hills covered with autumn leaves, farmhouses scattered like toys across the landscape, and roads that curved around hills his grandfather had once owned. He'd made this drive 1,000 times, but today everything looked different. The colors seemed brighter, the sky seemed wider, and even his old truck seemed to run smoother. Eleanor's journey took her through unfamiliar territory. She'd lived in the same small town for most of her adult life, and venturing into new places made her feel both adventurous and anxious. She drove carefully, checking her directions twice, worried about being late for what might be the most important meeting of her remaining years. The cafe where they'd agreed to meet was called Rosie's Place, a small diner that sat at the intersection of 2 country roads. It was the kind of establishment that served coffee strong enough to dissolve spoons in pie that people drove miles to taste. The owner, Rosie herself, had been watching people fall in love and fall apart over her coffee. For 30 years, Harold arrived first, packing his truck next to a row of motorcycles that belonged to a group of touring retirees. He sat in his truck for 5 minutes, gathering courage and checking his appearance one last time in the rearview mirror. He'd brought a small bouquet of flowers from his late wife's garden, the last chrysanthemums of the season, yellow and bronze like autumn itself. When Harold walked into Rosie's Place, the smell of bacon and fresh coffee hit him like a warm embrace. The diner was busy with the lunch crowd, full of farmers and travelers and local folks who came for the atmosphere as much as the food. Harold chose a booth near the window where he could watch for Eleanor's car, though he realized he had no idea what she drove. Eleanor arrived 10 minutes later, her heart beating fast as she parked her sensible sedan next to Harold's truck. She'd been picturing this moment for days, imagining what Harold would look like, how he'd sound, whether they'd have anything to talk about. She'd even practiced conversation starters in her car, feeling silly but desperate to make a good impression. When Eleanor walked through the cafe door, Harold knew immediately that she was the woman he'd come to meet. She moved with the careful dignity of someone who'd learned to navigate the world alone, and there was something in her eyes that recognized the same loneliness he carried. She was older than he'd expected, with silver hair and lines that spoke of both laughter and sorrow, but she was also more elegant than he'd dared to hope. Eleanor spotted Harold just as quickly. He was sitting alone in a booth, nervously turning a coffee cup in his hands, and everything about his posture said he was waiting for someone important. He was older than she'd imagined, wearing a suit that had seen better days, but his face was kind and his eyes held the same mixture of hope and fear that she felt in her own chest. They spent the first few minutes in awkward politeness, each trying to reconcile the person sitting across from them with the descriptions they'd been given. Harold offered Eleanor the chrysanthemums, and she accepted them with genuine pleasure, commenting on how beautiful they were. Eleanor complimented Harold's tie, and he blushed like a schoolboy, admitting that his late wife had chosen it for him. The conversation started slowly, like a car engine on a cold morning. They talked about the weather, the drive to the cafe, the quality of Rosie's coffee. But gradually, as the initial nervousness faded, they began to share real pieces of themselves. Harold told Eleanor about his farm, describing the challenges of working the land alone, the satisfaction of growing things, the way sunrise looked different when you'd been up since dawn. Eleanor talked about her love of reading, how she'd belonged to the same book club for 20 years, how she missed having someone to discuss stories with. She mentioned her travels with her various husbands, the places she'd seen, the dreams she'd had to put aside as she focused on caring for dying men. As the afternoon wore on, something unexpected began to happen. The lies the Morrison brothers had told started to fade in importance. Harold didn't care that Eleanor wasn't wealthy. Her intelligence and warmth were worth more than money. Eleanor didn't mind that Harold's farm was small and struggling. His gentleness and honesty were rare treasures. They discovered they both loved old movies, especially the musicals from the 1940s. They both missed the ritual of Sunday dinners with family, the satisfaction of cooking for someone who appreciated the effort. They both struggled with the silence of empty houses and the weight of memories that had nowhere to go. Harold found himself laughing for the first time in months when Eleanor told him about her attempts to fix her own plumbing, resulting in a flooded bathroom and a very angry cat. Eleanor felt her heart warm when Harold described teaching his grandchildren to fish, his face lighting up with genuine joy as he talked about their excitement at catching their first bluegill. The cafe began to empty as the afternoon stretched toward evening. Rosie herself came over to refill their coffee cups for the fourth time, smiling at the way these two older folks seemed to have forgotten the rest of the world existed. She'd seen plenty of first dates in her time, but there was something special about watching two people discover they weren't alone anymore. As the sun started to sink lower in the sky, Harold and Eleanor realized they'd been talking for over 4 hours. Neither wanted the conversation to end, but they both knew they needed to make a decision about what came next. They'd come to this meeting as strangers, carrying the expectations and lies that others had planted in their minds, but they were leaving as something else, two people who'd found an unexpected connection in a world that often felt too big and too lonely for comfort. When Harold suggested they get married that very day, Eleanor's first instinct was to laugh at the absurdity of it. But then she looked into his eyes and saw something she'd been searching for her entire life. Not passion or romance, but understanding and genuine companionship. And when she said yes, Harold felt like he could breathe properly for the first time since his wife had died. The drive to the courthouse felt like something out of a dream. Harold and Eleanor had decided to take both cars, just in case one of them changed their mind along the way. But as they drove through the small towns and farmland between Rosie's place and the county seat, neither one was having second thoughts. If anything, the decision felt more right with each passing mile. Eleanor kept glancing in her rearview mirror at Harold's old pickup truck following behind her sedan. She could see him gripping the steering wheel, probably as nervous as she was, and the sight made her smile. At 71, she'd never expected to feel butterflies in her stomach again, but here she was, driving to her 5th wedding with a man she'd met only hours before. Harold watched Eleanor's careful driving and found himself already feeling protective of this woman who was about to become his wife. She signaled every turn well in advance and kept exactly to the speed limit, the habits of someone who'd learned to be cautious about everything in life. He wondered what she was thinking, whether she was as scared and excited as he was. They reached the courthouse with 45 minutes to spare before closing time. The building was one of those old brick structures that had seen a century of human drama, births recorded, deaths certified, marriages begun, and divorces finalized. Harold and Eleanor parked side by side in the nearly empty lot, then sat in their respective cars for a moment, both gathering courage for what they were about to do. Eleanor was the first to get out. She smoothed her blue dress and checked her reflection in the car window, then walked over to Harold's truck. He rolled down his window, and she leaned in close enough that he could smell her perfume, something light and floral that reminded him of spring gardens. "Are you sure about this?" Eleanor asked, her voice steady but her eyes showing the same uncertainty he felt. Harold looked at this woman who was about to change his life completely. Her silver hair caught the late afternoon light, and there were laugh lines around her eyes that spoke of a lifetime of finding joy wherever she could. "I'm sure if you are," he said simply. They walked into the courthouse together, Eleanor carrying her small purse and Harold carrying the flowers he'd bought for her. The lobby was quiet except for the echo of their footsteps on the polished floor. A security guard pointed them toward the marriage license office, where a tired-looking clerk named Mrs. Chin was preparing to close up for the day. Mrs. Chun looked up from her paperwork with the expression of someone who'd seen everything twice. But when she saw Harold and Eleanor standing hand in hand, something in her face softened. She'd been issuing marriage licenses for 15 years, and she'd developed a sixth sense about couples. Some came in full of passion that would burn out in months, others came in with the solid foundation that would last decades. These two looked like they'd already lived through the fire and were ready for something steady and real. "We'd like to get married," Harold said, his voice only shaking slightly. Mrs. Chun glanced at the clock on the wall. "You know we close in 40 minutes, and you'll need witnesses." Eleanor spoke up. "We understand about the time. As for witnesses, we were hoping maybe someone here could help us with that." Mrs. Chun studied their faces for a long moment. She'd turned away plenty of couples who seemed to be making impulsive mistakes. But there was something different about Harold and Eleanor. They weren't giddy teenagers or drunk college students. They were two people who'd clearly thought this through, even if they'd only met that day. "Let me get the janitor," Mrs. Chun said finally. "Frank's been here 20 years. He's witnessed more weddings than most ministers." While Mrs. Chin went to find Frank, Harold and Eleanor filled out the marriage license application. Their hands brushed as they passed the pen back and forth, and Eleanor noticed that Harold's handwriting was careful and neat, the script of someone who'd learned to write when penmanship mattered. Frank the janitor turned out to be a cheerful man in his 60s who'd been mopping floors and witnessing love stories since before either Harold or Eleanor had been widowed. He took one look at the nervous couple and broke into a wide grin. "Another sunset special," Frank said to Mrs. Chun. "I love these. The afternoon weddings always seem to work out better than the morning ones." Mrs. Chun led them to a small room next to her office that served as the courthouse's wedding chapel. It wasn't much to look at: folding chairs arranged in short rows, a small podium at the front, and artificial flowers that had seen better decades. But the late afternoon sun was streaming through the tall windows, painting everything in warm, golden light. Harold excused himself for a moment and hurried back to the parking lot. Eleanor watched through the window as he opened his truck door and rummaged around in the cab. When he came back, he was carrying a small velvet box that looked like it had been well loved. "This was my grandmother's wedding ring," Harold explained, opening the box to reveal a simple gold band with a tiny diamond. "My wife wore it for 42 years. I thought maybe you might like to wear it now." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the ring. It wasn't expensive or flashy, but it was beautiful in its simplicity. More importantly, it represented a lifetime of love and commitment, values that mattered more to her than any monetary worth. "I would be honored to wear it," Eleanor said softly. They realized they needed a ring for Harold, too. Eleanor remembered passing a small jewelry store on the way to the courthouse, but it would be closed by now. Then Frank spoke up from where he'd been quietly arranging chairs. "There's a pawn shop 3 blocks down that stays open late," Frank suggested. "Might not be fancy, but they'll have something that works." Eleanor insisted on going herself, too. "Pick out Harold's ring." She drove the 3 blocks quickly, her heart racing as she realized how little time they had left. The pawn shop was exactly what she'd expected, crowded with the cast-off treasures of other people's lives. But the owner was kind, and when Eleanor explained her situation, he helped her find a simple gold band that would fit Harold's finger. She made it back to the courthouse with 10 minutes to spare. Harold slipped the ring onto his finger, and it fit perfectly as if it had been made for him. They stood together in the small chapel, holding hands like teenagers. While Mrs. Chun prepared to perform the ceremony, Mrs. Chun had officiated hundreds of weddings, but she took extra care with Harold and Eleanor's vows. She spoke about love, taking many forms, about companionship being just as valuable as passion, about the courage it takes to open your heart again after loss. Her words seemed written specifically for this moment, for these two people who'd found each other in the most unexpected way when Harold slipped his grandmother's ring onto Eleanor's finger. His voice was steady as he promised to cherish and protect her for whatever time they had left. When Eleanor placed the pawnshop ring on Harold's hand, she promised to stand beside him through whatever joys and sorrows lay ahead. Frank and Mrs. Chun applauded as Harold kissed Eleanor's cheek, gently sealing their marriage just as the sun was setting outside the courthouse windows. The golden light filled the small chapel, making everything look like a scene from an old movie. Beautiful and timeless and exactly right. As they signed the marriage certificate, Eleanor caught Harold's eye and smiled. "Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton," she said, trying out her new name. "I think I like the sound of that." Harold squeezed her hand. "I think I like the sound of it too." The Morrison brothers had been waiting at Murphy's Diner since 5 o'clock, nursing cups of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. They'd positioned themselves at a table near the window where they could see anyone coming down Main Street. Tonight was going to be their masterpiece of cruelty, and they didn't want to miss a single moment of Harold's humiliation. Tommy kept checking his watch and grinning at his younger brother. "Should be any minute now," he said, rubbing his hands together, like a man warming them over a fire. Old Harold's probably driving home alone right about now, wondering how he got fooled so bad. Billy was practically bouncing in his seat with anticipation. They'd spent the whole day imagining different scenarios of how the meeting would go wrong. Maybe Eleanor would take one look at Harold's old clothes and walk right back out. Maybe Harold would see Eleanor's age and realize he'd been had. Either way, the brothers were certain their victims would return home feeling more foolish and desperate than ever. "I wish we could have been there to see their faces," Billy said, chuckling to himself. Bet that old woman turned around and left before she even sat down. The brothers had already planned their follow-up torment. They'd ask Harold innocent questions about how his date went, watch him squirm with embarrassment, then gradually reveal that they'd set him up with a woman old enough to be in a nursing home. They'd stretch out his humiliation for weeks, maybe months, telling the story to anyone who'd listen. At exactly 7:30, Harold's pickup truck turned onto Main Street. Tommy nudged Billy and pointed toward the window. "Here comes our entertainment," he said, but as the truck got closer, both brothers leaned forward in confusion. There was someone in the passenger seat. Someone with silver hair wearing a blue dress. "What the hell?" Tommy muttered. Harold parked right in front of the diner, and the brothers watched in growing bewilderment as he walked around to open the passenger door for Eleanor. She stepped out gracefully, smoothing her dress and smiling at something Harold said. They were holding hands like teenagers, and there was something about their body language that looked nothing like the disaster the Morrison brothers had expected. Billy's jaw dropped open as Harold and Eleanor walked toward the diner entrance. "Together, they're supposed to hate each other," he whispered to his brother. "She's supposed to be disgusted. He's supposed to be disappointed." When Harold pushed open the diner door and held it for Eleanor, the entire restaurant seemed to notice. Conversations quieted as people turned to look at the well-dressed couple who just walked in. Harold was beaming with pride, and Eleanor was glowing with happiness. They looked like people who just won the lottery, not like victims of a cruel joke. Harold spotted the Morrison brothers immediately and walked straight to their table, Eleanor on his arm. Tommy and Billy scrambled to arrange their faces into expressions of innocent curiosity, but their shock was still visible around the edges. "Tommy, Billy," Harold said warmly, "I want you to meet my wife, Eleanor." "Eleanor, these are the gentlemen I told you about, the ones who introduced us." Eleanor extended her hand to each brother with the grace of someone who'd spent years learning how to handle social situations. She'd figured out within the first 5 minutes of meeting Harold that something wasn't quite right about the way they'd been brought together. The details didn't match up, and both of them had been fed stories that were too good to be true. But Eleanor was a smart woman who'd learned to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. "I can't thank you enough," Eleanor said to the stunned brothers. her voice warm but her eyes sharp. "Harold is exactly the kind of man I've been hoping to find. You two have quite a talent for matchmaking." Tommy found his voice first, though it came out as more of a croak. You got married?" Harold pulled out Eleanor's chair and helped her sit down before taking his own seat. "This afternoon, as a matter of fact. Right there at the courthouse. Eleanor didn't want to wait, and honestly, neither did I when you know. Billy was staring at Eleanor like she'd grown a second head. This wasn't how their plan was supposed to work. The woman sitting across from him looked confident and content, not embarrassed or angry. And Harold looked happier than Billy had seen him in years. But you just met, Billy Este. Eleanor smiled and patted Harold's hand. "Sometimes. The best things in life happen quickly. We're both old enough to know what we want, and we're both tired of wasting time on games and long courtships." The brothers exchanged panicked glances. Their cruel joke was backfiring in the worst possible way. Instead of creating misery, they'd apparently created a love story. Instead of humiliating two lonely people, they'd given them exactly what they needed. Harold was practically glowing as he told the story of their day. He described their conversation at Rosie's place. The drive to the courthouse, the simple ceremony, and the golden afternoon light. He talked about Eleanor like she was the most wonderful woman who'd ever lived. Praising her intelligence, her humor, her kindness, Eleanor added her own details, talking about Harold's gentleness, his honesty, his willingness to take a chance on happiness. She mentioned how surprised she'd been by his thoughtfulness, the way he'd opened doors for her. The family ring he'd offered her to wear, Pete, the diner owner, came over to congratulate the newlyweds. Other customers started approaching their table, offering best wishes and asking to hear about their whirlwind romance. Word spread quickly through the small restaurant that Harold Pemberton had gotten married that very day to a lovely woman from the next county. The Morrison brothers sat in their chairs like men watching their house burn down. Every congratulation offered to Harold and Eleanor felt like a personal insult. Every smile, every laugh, every expression of joy was proof that their plan had gone horribly wrong. Tommy tried one last, desperate attempt to salvage their scheme. "Harold," he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "I hope you told Eleanor about your financial situation." Harold looked puzzled for a moment, then laughed. "You mean how I'm land rich but cash poor? Of course I did. Eleanor's too smart to be fooled by big talk about money." Eleanor squeezed Harold's hand. "I told him about my own circumstances, too. 4 husbands worth of modest savings and a house that needs work. We'll pool our resources and figure it out together." The brothers realized with growing horror that Harold and Eleanor had been honest with each other. They'd shared the truth about their lives, their finances, their hopes and fears. The lies Tommy and Billy had told didn't matter because the couple had found something real to build on. As the evening wore on, it became clear that Harold and Eleanor's marriage was already the talk of the town. People were calling it romantic, brave, inspiring. The story of 2 lonely people finding love and having the courage to grab it was exactly the kind of tale that small towns love to tell and retell. By the time Harold and Eleanor left the diner to start their new life together, the Morrison brothers were sitting alone at their table, staring into cold coffee and wondering how their perfect plan for cruelty had turned into someone else's perfect love story. The joke was on them, and everyone in town would soon know it. They'd tried to mock 2 decent people and had instead given them the greatest gift possible, each other. Harold and Eleanor drove home that night as husband and wife, while Tommy and Billy sat in their empty house, realizing they'd just witnessed something they'd never understand: the power of genuine human connection to triumph over petty meanness. The cruel scheme had failed completely. But Harold and Eleanor's marriage was just beginning.